the Sphinx is a super compelling argument in my mind for architecture that has been there for more than 10,000 years. There's a really great book by Dr. Robert Schoch. Have you ever heard of him? His book is amazing, and I've had the pleasure of speaking to his wife a little bit. His book is such a compelling case, and he feels that same way, that the Sphinx is really compelling for a piece of architecture that's been around for more than 10,000 years rather than the pyramids. So what's interesting is, so the Sphinx, I believe, is largely carved out of, at least the outside of the Great Pyramids. It's the same type of stone. It's all limestone. And so when you look at the erosion on the Sphinx and you look at how much we know that the dynastic Egyptians were trying to repair the Sphinx, and eventually it was so old and unrepairable that I think around the reign of Akhenaten, this is like 1400 BC. The Sphinx was built in about 2650 or 2560 BC. So about 1100 years later, during the Middle Kingdom, I believe, getting close to the New Kingdom, a pharaoh comes in and decides to bury the Sphinx. They bury it purposely. They have like the dream stela that's put in there between the paws. That dream stela was carved 1,000 years after they think that that traditional archaeologists think that the Sphinx was built. So anyways, they go in there, they bury the Sphinx. But this is the problem. Traditional archaeologists, Egyptologists, say that the Sphinx was built at exactly the same time as the Pyramid of Khafre, which Khafre is the center pyramid on the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. You've got Khufu's pyramid, Khafre's pyramid in the middle, and then Menkaure. So Khufu is the father, Khafre is the son, and then Menkaure may be the grandson or maybe the great grandson. And so the Pyramid of Khafre that's in the middle, almost directly in front of that is the Sphinx, and the Sphinx Temple. And so, but the problem with the Sphinx is when you look at the erosion inside that pit, it doesn't match up at all. Because what traditional Egyptologists say is that, so they built it in 2560 BC, and over the course of the next 1,000 to 1,100 years, those deep erosional markings that are inside the pit, that had to have happened within the course of 1,000 years, because they say that the Sphinx has been around for about, I think, 4,500 years. And all of that erosion, there are geologists who go there, and when they just show them, or geologists who have been there, they bring back photos and they show other professors and they say, "What does this look like to you?" And they're like, that's over 10,000 years of limestone erosion. And they're like, but this is in the pit of the Sphinx. So traditional Egyptologists are basically, I don't think they have a way of explaining this, but they're not going to admit that it could be much older than dynastic Egypt. But what they're saying is that, what they're essentially forcing everyone to have to believe is that within that 1,000 years before the Egyptians, while they're trying to repair it, and then before they bury the Sphinx, all of that erosion happened in that short little window. That doesn't make any sense. But that erosion that we see there, we just don't see it on the pyramids. Like you don't see the weathering of those blocks in the same way that you see in places like the Sphinx Temple. There's some evidence of it at the Valley Temple. Like in Egypt, I think there's all kinds of examples of something that could have been there for more than 10,000 years, but I don't think that the pyramids are the best example of that. But then at the same time, whoever built the pyramids, like the argument that they're making, which I have to agree with, whoever built the pyramids was also capable of doing all these other things, like building, constructing the Serapeum, the boxes, the diorite granite boxes that are in the Serapeum, constructing the Osiris shaft. I believe those are the correct names. It's just because we may know who built the pyramids, it doesn't answer how they built it at all whatsoever. And I think a lot of Egyptologists do that. They go, well, the evidence really points towards that it was the old kingdom in Egypt around 2600 BC. So that's that. But then they don't, they can't admit that we have literally no idea how it was done.
And I think Robert Schoch is the one who found out that there's water erosion on the Sphinx.
Yeah.
That it's actually not wind and sand, it's made by water. And it would make sense. I don't know if that would make sense that there was no water erosion on the pyramids, because didn't there used to be like huge casing stones like completely covering all sides of the pyramids?
Yeah, there used to be, but on the Menkaure pyramid, there's those casing stones are still there. And they don't bear that same kind of erosion. But then again, you could argue that the pyramids on the plateau are higher up. They're quite a bit higher up in elevation than the Sphinx. But,
oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's an incline, I believe.
Okay.
I've never been there to see it for myself, so I'm kind of basing this off of really studying it on Google Earth and looking at some maps. But yeah, I think like the plateau, it's raised up, you know. So I mean, there's the argument that but then also, okay, so then you got to think about, so the pyramids would have been built in a time during it would have been built during a time when the Sahara was green. So if the pyramids were built 11,500 years ago, 12,500 years ago, then it would have been built in a time when the Sahara was green and experienced much more rainfall. So you would see on the pyramids, you would see the devastating effects of erosion that you see on the Sphinx. Like the Sphinx is completely destroyed by erosion and water erosion. But you don't see that on the pyramids. But maybe if they were still completely covered in the casing stones. But then again, at the top of the Khafre pyramid in the middle, those casing stones are still at the top. They never pulled those casing stones down. And I don't know that I've ever seen a complete study done on that, but I'd like to see, do those casing stones show any weathering that would be like, you know, it wouldn't have been experiencing rainfall for 12,000 years, but maybe if it was made about 10,500 BC, it probably would have been experiencing rainfall for another, Africa starts to dry up around 6,000 BC, around the area it begins. So it would have been experiencing rainfall for like 4,000 years on a semi-regular basis.
It's probably possible that, I think people have speculated too, that the Sphinx is way older than the pyramids.
I believe that.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and Robert Schoch, I think he falls in that area too. I think that he's a little dubious about the pyramids, which I am as well. And I think Graham Hancock is too. I think so.
What do you mean?
I've heard him in some places I've heard him kind of concede that the pyramids might not be this like Atlantean civilization, because there's a lot of evidence that stacks up that the Egyptians may have done it. It does not answer the question of how they did it.
What is the lot of evidence, though, that shows that they may have done it?